Today, we have the privilege of speaking with esteemed speaker, consultant, and professor, Terri Givens, Dr. Terri Givens. Terri, thank you so much for joining us on Future of XYZ.
Oh, it's really my pleasure to be here with you.
So I'm really excited because we're going to talk about the future of empathy. And empathy is a topic that I have a huge passion for as a values-based leader and brand builder. I also wrote a thesis myself talking about reciprocity, mutual respect, and empathy as a piece of that in college. So when this opportunity came on to talk to you, who has so much experience in the higher ed space as the first female and first African-American vice provost at Menlo Park College, as well, obviously, as at the University of Texas, Austin, and now you're a professor at McGill University up in Montreal in political science, and you've served in other capacities in higher education as well. You've written a lot about racism and anti-racism. You have a book on the roots of racism. You have a book on immigration in the 21st century. But your most recent book that came out last year, or maybe 2 years ago now, is called Radical Empathy. And I really, really want to talk about the future of empathy in the context of this. But as I always try to do, the first question for any guest on the subject matter is how do we define empathy?
Right. And, it's interesting because there's kind of a clinical definition of empathy, but I like to think about empathy kind of in a more organic way, that it's this idea that you can actually put yourself in somebody else's shoes and see their perspective, but go beyond that. Because we talk a lot about, I need to see it from somebody else's perspective. It's not just about that. It's actually thinking about not only can I put myself in their shoes and try to understand how they're feeling, what the actions they might take, but it's also, thinking through, what would I do, not as Terri in that person's shoes, but as that person, and it really pushes you to understand the broader experiences of somebody, because it's easy to say, oh yeah, I can see things from their perspective, but no, you have to go a little bit beyond that and say, I not only can see things from their perspective, but given their broader experience, right? You have to think about from a more global perspective.
It is. It's a macro kind of lens that you're taking because, of course, that old adage, walk a mile in, my shoes, your shoes, his shoes, her shoes, their shoes, it is so important, but it's almost impossible to do if you don't understand contextually, historically, systemically what that actually means, right?
Absolutely. And that's exactly why I tell people, so I have steps, right, for radical empathy. So I might as well introduce those now.
Absolutely. Please.
So the first step is the willingness to be vulnerable, because, and people ask me all the time, oh, being vulnerable, I can't do that. It's not being vulnerable with other people necessarily. I do think you need to be vulnerable with others, but the first step is being vulnerable with yourself. And I know because I had to be vulnerable. I mean, if you read my book, I'm vulnerable all over the place. And that was extremely difficult. That was probably the hardest part of writing this book, was that first step was willingness to be vulnerable, because I had to open up and say, oh my God, I have to understand, it's funny because you think about empathy, but self-empathy is so important. And that's the vulnerability component. And, I'm a big fan of Brene Brown and her ideas about vulnerability.
Yeah.
And so that vulnerability allows you to look inside yourself and say, oh, I was impacted by the way my parents raised me. I was impacted in a particular way because of structural racism, whatever it may be. And how we I talk a lot about, internalized depression, but we internalize so much. It's not even, internalized depression necessarily. It's just we internalize a lot, right?
Absolutely.
And it comes from our families, from our friends, from society more broadly, right? So we live in a context. And
can I just ask you something really quickly? Because sorry to interrupt, but I know that first step is being vulnerable. And you talked about being vulnerable with ourselves and kind of self-empathy. There's a lot of talk in the healing world and personal development world around compassion and self-compassion. Mm-hmm. How are empathy and compassion different?
Right. And so I see
for yourself, but broadly.
Right. Absolutely. And I talk about this in the book because compassion, it's like compassion is kind of, I have compassion for you but I feel sorry for you. Compassion to me is just too static. It's not, and we might as well put it out there because radical empathy is about taking action, right? And so I feel like compassion is great. I have compassion for a lot of people. I have compassion for people who are, we have several wars going on in the world right now. I have compassion for those people. But, what am I doing about it? Am I actually, going beyond just compassion? So, there's a huge overlap between empathy and compassion, but I see empathy going further, right? I'm not just feeling sorry for somebody. I'm actually trying to understand how they're being, like, what would it be like to be in that situation where somebody doesn't have access to water? And what can I do about it? And so the radical component of radical empathy is taking action. Yeah. Doing something, it may be, as simple as making a donation to the Red Cross, but it could be as much as, going into a nearby community and saying, how can I help you guys get fresh water?
Yeah. I love that. It's tied to action. I think given what your background is, professional background and educational background specifically, there is this very, I think, developed understanding how important empathy is to healthy human relationships and being able to grow and develop as a human, which is, of course, what education is all about. Higher education is all about. As we look at this, kind of not just experiencing their point of view, we talk about the macro and understanding. I mean, what is the role of empathy in kind of the state of the world that we live in today, which is so divisive and chaotic, and as you said, multiple wars and climate crises and various other debt crises and various other things happening? What is the state of empathy, and how important is it for a healthy, functioning society?
Well, part of the reason I wrote this book is I see these divides developing, both from a political perspective, but more broadly. I mean, basic things like, understanding that climate change impacts all of us, not just one group or another, right? And so, the subtitle to the book, Radical Empathy, Finding a Path to Bridging Racial Divides. But I think it goes beyond, if I could redo it, I would say just finding a path to bridging divides, period. Because, I focus on the racial component because that's my life experience as well as my research. But I think it's important for other divides as well. So I think that empathy is problematic right now. People are having a hard time empathizing with, and actually it's almost like there's been this individualistic push, since the 80s, really, to say, oh, it's just about you, and you need your freedom, and we forget that we have this community, right? It's interesting because people want to say, yeah, and people, it's the funny thing is, even some of the people who are, the most individualistic, I recognize, oh, well, except for, kind of the survivalists who live somewhere, but we all live in communities, and we're all impacted by what's happening in our community. And I think we've lost sight of the fact that as a country in the United States, and in a lot of countries, not just the US, Canada, wherever, we've forgotten this idea that, what impacts my neighbor, that's why I talk about, the do unto others aspect of it.
Absolutely.
Why wouldn't I do unto others? And because we all are impacted, and we forget that. And so I was hoping to write something that would come at it from a perspective of somebody who started by looking at myself, right? And not just somebody saying, oh, you need to do that. No, I needed to do it first.
Yeah.
Right? I can't go and tell you to have empathy unless I focus on why I need to have empathy.
Yeah.
And so that's the approach of this book, is to say that we've lost that perspective of having, understanding why I'm not having empathy for maybe somebody who's across the political divide, turning that around and saying, and I want to mention one of my favorite things a friend of mine, Greg Sattel, said, which is empathy is not absolution. And this is part of the problem. I think people think if I have empathy, it means I'm agreeing with somebody who has an opposite perspective from me. And it's not true at all. Empathy, or, doing unto others, doesn't mean I have to agree with that person. I can completely disagree with somebody and still have empathy for them, try to understand their perspective and understand why they are doing what they're doing. Because guess what? If you do that, you can then understand how to respond to them in a way that maybe you can change their opinion. I mean, the reason we're having these divides is people are like, oh, I refuse to, look at what you're looking at or try to understand you because I don't agree with it. And whereas if we try to understand what's going on, and unfortunately, some of it is manipulative and
Yes.
the a lot of the stuff.
Disinformation, misinformation, conscious manipulation by other means. Yeah.
Exactly. So that's hard to battle against. But at a minimum, at a human level, we can say, I'm going to try to have some empathy with this person. I've had neighbors who I disagreed with, but I could still have empathy for them.
Absolutely.
Right?
Well, and you studied international relations as an undergrad at Stanford, and then you went on and you got a master's and a PhD in political science, which, by the way, is also what I studied, but you were at UCLA. And I think political science people always think is politics. And of course, it's not, right? It's the functionings and the undergirdings of government and civil society. If you go back to the philosophers from ages, there's always a point of view on what works. And I'm hearing in what you're talking about here as a proposition, and even the abridged, new title of your, your book is really talking about how do we make action and how do we get progress in whatever system and that is. And I think, I want to go back to those 6 steps that you outline in the book because they really do play a role, starting with that willingness to be vulnerable. But there's a role that they play, I think, from what I've learned about how we kind of, let's just say how we develop human empathy going forward, which is exactly you and I agree is essential.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's a process, and it's a never-ending process. Like I kind of consider these 6 steps circular because after willingness to be vulnerable, you have to be grounded in who you are, and that was so critical to my own development, including as a leader, is being grounded in who I am in the sense that I'm not going to hide who I am. I'm not going to try to fit myself into whatever. I'm not going to be a square peg in a round hole kind of thing, and to also have to mention Whitney Houston. My favorite song of hers is The Greatest Love of All, and learning to love yourself, right? I mean, that's where I see so much pain in our society is people who just can't, first of all, can't empathize or love themselves. And people think, oh, you're just full of yourself if you love yourself. It's like, no, that's not it at all. It's like, how can you love somebody else if you don't love yourself and you don't see your own humanity? Right. So that's a huge component of it. And then being open to the experiences of others. Right. So I feel like you have to get through those first steps before you can be open to the experiences of others. And that's so critical as a leader, as somebody, as a teacher, as somebody who is working with anybody. Right. You have to be open to other people's experiences, but also from the perspective of I'm accepting of myself, so I'm going to be accepting of you. And then we go on to practicing empathy. We think that empathy, some people have empathy, some don't. No, practicing empathy is so critical. And actually, I try to model that behavior, but I also, I talk pretty specifically about it in the classroom now with my students. Ever since I, started teaching again after writing this book, I really do try to talk to them about modeling empathy, as we're having class discussions, put yourself in, look at it from the perspective of your classmate, and you get such deep, interesting discussions because they're not so worried that a classmate is going to jump on them for saying something. And so that practicing empathy is a daily thing. I do it all the time. I'm not perfect at it. Nobody is, but it's something you have to practice to get to that taking action.
And I want to pause you because I know that there are 2 more steps, but you've set something up that I really want to explore, Terri, which is you're teaching empathy in the classroom. And obviously with your long background in higher education, both on the higher institutional education side, but also as this former CEO of the Center for Higher Education Leadership and a consultant in other capacities, I feel like you've seen this. Like, where does empathy fit in modern curriculums? And obviously you're teaching it right now as a result of this book, but does it exist elsewhere? And is there a role for teaching empathy in a world that is becoming more and more isolated and divided?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I worked with the Menlo Park City School District. I've worked with many, many universities and individuals on this. And empathy, I wouldn't necessarily say it needs to be an explicit part of the curriculum. I think what's better from my perspective is like I have a whole chapter on inclusive leadership, which is, in a sense, I need to retitle that. The next edition, well, I'll talk about it differently because it's really just about learning to be inclusive more generally that allows us to, to really demonstrate empathy and build empathy into our classrooms. But I've worked with, superintendents and principals and various folks and even the leadership at my current institution, McGill, and I feel like I'm constantly coming back to them and saying, you need to have some I just wrote a note to my provost saying, we're in a really difficult discussion about some issues, and I said, this is where empathy comes in, right? So it's not that I'm going to sit in the classroom and say, here's your lesson on empathy. It's more that it's like, anti-racism. You don't want to stand up there. That's why I don't like, DEI workshops, because it's like, okay, we're going to spend an hour talking about how to have diversity, equity, inclusion. No, it's something that has to filter into every aspect of your teaching, of your day-to-day life. And so it's more about learning how to model, learning, internalizing empathy and how to take action. And in doing that, bringing it into the classroom. And I actually need to put together a little packet because I'm always asked about, how you do that. And, if you have a class or you're going to have discussion, let the class, you'll work through this with the class and, have them decide what the rules are for engagement, so that they're internalizing, oh, I want them to listen to me. So I need to figure out what are the rules we need to have so that we listen to each other.
Sorry, it comes back to what I think where my head was when I was, 21 years old, which is about, it was like self versus capital O other was the title of the thesis, which was all about, how do you overcome the fact that we are all individuals? There's some shared experiences, by being an African-American from Alabama. There's an experience of being African-American in America. There's an experience of being Black in the world, right? I mean, just to they're not all the same. They're microcosms, and we can, on any topic, whether we're talking LGBTQ plus, whether they're talking about, white supremacy in a different manner, whether we're talking about being a woman, there are so many, different ways that we otherize. And I think, where we're talking about in a world that studies, data is showing that the world is becoming less and less empathetic. Actually, legitimately, which is kind of crazy. And also science shows that humans tend to be more empathetic towards people who look like them, behave like them, are from there. So what you're talking about in the classroom of having to internalize for yourself first, and then being able to say, oh, we need some rules of engagement in order to understand, it is what I'm thinking is the future of empathy, which is it's almost like cognitive behavioral therapy. You have to have a pause.
Exactly.
Right?
Yes, absolutely. And I love that connection to cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, because I've been working with this a little bit with my son who has the ADHD. And it's again, so there's something, he doesn't necessarily have all this, his brain works differently. He's neurodivergent. And so I know that there's certain things he has to practice because they don't come to him as easily as they do to me or others. And so he needs to understand it's not through any fault of his own, it's just, this is the way his brain works. And so not everybody, some people are more empathetic than others. And that, for whatever reason that may be, it may be through training, it may be through, just the way they were, whatever.
Yeah.
And nature. And so that's why it's important to understand that this isn't, we have to work at it. And just like with cognitive behavioral therapy, it's like a therapy, right? Yeah. We can call it empathy therapy. Yeah. So I really love kind of putting it in that kind of context, that's why I say practicing empathy is so important.
And after practicing empathy, because that's the fourth step in your book, what comes after? We've talked about willingness to be vulnerable, being grounded in who you are, being open to the experience of others, and then practicing empathy. What are the other two steps?
And that's the radical part of it. It's so funny because I think some people see radical and they're like, oh, it's crazy. No, it's like radical part is taking action because, like I said, it's easy or easier to have empathy, but to take action is a whole nother thing. And that's why I think, I wanted to make my book a different approach, which is that, no, we're not just going to say, have empathy, here's some stories. No, it's like, how do you take action? And actually, my next book project, I'm still working on the proposal, but it hopefully will be out in a year or two, is to look at how have people taken action? Because every chapter ends with here's some actions you can take. But I really want to, say, no, here's what people have done. Here's some examples, right? Yeah. And especially since the summer of 2020 and George Floyd, how did people follow up, on their pledges? Who's actually done something? And there's a lot of really good examples out there. And there's a lot of examples of people who made pledges and didn't do anything. So, yes, it goes both ways.
Absolutely.
So taking action and creating change and building trust is really, the important, I think, the radical side of it. If we can create change and build trust through empathy, then I think that's what's going to really get us to what I know you want to talk about next, which is the future.
Because I mean, look, it's understood by scientists that people start developing empathy as young as like fully developed by like 18 months, and it just continues to advance, or perhaps not, as science is currently showing, over the course of childhood, adolescence, and then kind of stops at some point. And what you're talking about is taking action as an adult, really, because that's where you have that moment of reckoning and where societal change can really happen. And of course, the subtitle to your book is, I might get it wrong, Finding a Path to Bridging Racial Divides, which is, of course, this can be used for anything, but that is your purpose here. So I understand the follow-up of the book. And I think the sixth step, of course, is maybe where that future lies. So talk to me as our last question, Terri, about kind of what your greatest hope is for the future, and how empathy plays into that, thinking 5, 10, 20 years out.
Well, I'm really hoping that empathy more generally becomes includes things like inclusive leadership and inclusion becomes part of, actually, it's interesting. A friend told me that they're like teaching my book at the Stanford Law School, and several business schools have are talking about it. And so I would love to see this kind of infiltrating into higher education more broadly, because that's where the leaders are coming from. So I think higher education has a huge role to play in this, in the sense that are some of our top leaders. Some aren't, some didn't go to college, but for those who do go, especially law school, MBA, but even just basic undergraduate, making this a component of it. And, it's so funny because they're talking about banning DEI. It's like, we don't need DEI. We need people to understand each other. I mean, I'm not going to say DEI should go away at all. I think it's important. But I do think that we need to keep in mind for the future going forward, let's move away from trying to package things in a way that is unfortunately becoming, divisive, and just say, look, if we can get people to understand empathy and inclusion and belonging, maybe we can get to a different idea about how we get, because we've been doing DEI for a long time. That's why I wrote this book, because I was like, we aren't getting anywhere. If we're going to get somewhere, we have to go beyond. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly why I tell people, because it's like, if you have a person who's the head of DEI at an institution, then DEI is their responsibility. I tell every leader I work with, from the chancellor and provost and president, principal, whatever, you are the lead DEI person on your campus, in your institution, in your organization. You are the top DEI person. And if you are not, then it's not happening.
It's so accurate. And I think Radical, your book, the steps, the tools, and just this conversation really helps frame up how that can happen, and that it has to happen, as you say, start with yourself. Radical empathy, The Future of Empathy with Dr. Terri Givens. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's really a conversation I would really love to be sitting down with a cup of coffee and a lot more time.
Yes, absolutely. Well, we'll have to follow up and grab that coffee sometime. But thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Well, thank you for joining us. And for everyone watching, thank you for watching us on Future of XYZ. If you didn't already know, you can also listen wherever you get your favorite podcasts, Apple, Spotify, Amazon, wherever. You can also watch on YouTube at ripbs.org/XYZ. Make sure you follow us on Instagram. And if you want to nominate yourself or someone else as a guest, reach out via future-of.xyz. We look forward to another conversation in 2 weeks' time. For now, think about everything we've talked about with Dr. Terri Givens. Consider getting her book, Radical Empathy, to learn more about how we can each be part of the change that we need to see in this world. Thank you. Speak again soon.